So we have Jacob Johansen and Anthony Faramelli joining us in the wake of their recent webinar on psychosocial perspectives on contemporary fascism. We were also going to have Nini Fang from Edinburgh, but she's unable to join us today. Unfortunately, she's been called away, but we do also have Gabriel Soler from Edinburgh, who has written very movingly about his experience of growing up under fascism. So I'm going to start talking with Jacob, whose work has been influenced by media and communications studies. He spoke in the webinar about the work of Tony Sampson, who's I'm certainly familiar with. I don't know about anyone else. And psychoanalysis also, and psychosocial studies and critical theory. I'm always impressed with anyone who really knows what critical theory is, so I might have to come to that.
I don't claim to.
I don't know what there's literary theory and so many different theories. Critical theory is confuses me. So Jacob, you spoke about in the lecture about incels and the construction of the identity of the incel, and I've wanted to start there with this sort of particular instance of what we might call a fascistic arrangement. Would you like to tell me what interested you in this group, or how you came into studying this particular phenomenon?
Yeah, so I kind of became aware of incels, I think that must have been sort of 2018, maybe sort of 2017, 2018. And probably like many people who sort of came across this community, I was quite shocked by it, and particularly how it was sort of at least sort of parts of it were really embracing wider kind of very, very problematic kind of discourses, ideas, images from sort of that come sort of from wider Chan culture, so come from spaces like 4chan and also the alt-right, and that there is kind of this sort of very destructive overlap between, at least in parts, between incels and then sort of forces like the alt-right and what we could call kind of sort of networked neo-fascism, and that so that was the incels were kind of the first sort of community that I encountered, which we could kind of count as being part of the manosphere. I mean, incels have a longer, sort of much longer history, but they are certainly kind of grew in the sense that we kind of know about them now in the wake of Gamergate, and we can talk about Gamergate in a minute if we want to. Sort of, and that was that all of that was kind of connected to rise of Trumpism, Trump's kind of very online election campaign in 2015, 2016. That was really sort of tapping into social media dynamics and those kinds of sort of desires that Anthony also talked about in his talk. And I'm not. I think I don't see myself as like a masculinity scholar. I'm not sort of was never really interested in questions of masculinity before, and don't claim to be particularly kind of knowledgeable when it comes to
You were
kind of
interested
work.
in the digital, I suppose, the rise of a digitally mediated shared psychological experience. Is that where your interest?
Yeah, and I've always been kind of interested in. I've always been looking at sort of the digital or the internet and social media and so on from a psychoanalytic perspective, and kind of interested in sort of thinking about subcultures and communities and so on online a little bit. And when this whole kind of incel thing became so more kind of mainstream, and lots of mainstream media started picking up on this phenomenon, it was sort of, and still is, and being covered a lot in the media. That kind of that's what got me interested in it, to kind of look into this a bit more. Yeah, that was sort of my starting point, really. And how on one level it's very, these communities are very niche. They're very they come sort of out of Chan culture, 4chan, and kind of Reddit and those spaces, but at the same time they totally kind of penetrated or totally sort of infiltrated mainstream media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and so on. So it's sort of it was sort of moving outwards into spaces that we all encounter and that we all kind of occupy. Yeah,
I have a sort of, because my image, I've drawn a kind of spiral, and I had an image of the incel as kind of spiraling inwards, if you like, and like all obsessive behavior or thought, it has become disconnected from whatever it might originally have sparked those feelings, and yet what you are finding on the social media is that it starts infiltrating outwards. I guess the tropes or the ideas starting to inhabit other spaces. Is that?
yeah, and of course it's also like, this is not this kind of, I mean, if we these all these communities are very 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 layered, and they're very very complex. So it's, in particular, I think with incels, there is no kind of one incel community. It's gone through lots of kind of sort of historical development already, even though in its kind of current sort of being, it's still a very sort of fairly young community. But because it's been there was initially a kind of huge original kind of incels subreddit that was called Incels, and that was banned at some point, I think in 2016 or 2017. So that kind of huge space was shut down, and then sort of numerous smaller spaces emerged, both on Reddit, but also then lots of those who had originally been part of this kind of first incel subreddit moved to kind of create their own forum, which is still around today, which is called Incels. I think it was called incels.co initially. Now it's recently changed the domain again, but that's still around. So there's already kind of sort of a history to this community where it's kind of been sort of moving around, and the different sort of spaces that incels occupy, they also differ. And there are some where they are sort of slightly more destructive, or more kind of more kind of hateful, more kind of fascist than others. So it's very kind of it's very kind of layered, and it is kind of quite sort of enclosed, or quite sort of as with all these kind of subcultures, they are primarily interested in just being sort of being in their own space.
Do you think?
And of course, I mean, this kind of misogyny that we see there, it has that history is thousands of years old. I mean, that in a sense, that's not new. And that's why kind of I was so interested, or that's why in my book, where I have only sort of one chapter on incels, where I kind of look at various communities of the manosphere in the book. That's why I was so interested in kind of I'm really quite heavily drawing on kind of historical sort of discussion of fascism and masculinity and bodies by Klaus Teweleit in his kind of male fantasies books. So I was quite interested in kind of thinking about what are potential similarities but of course also differences between how Teweleit wrote about sort of German sort of proto-fascist men of the 1920s, who then sort of become sort of proper fascists in the from the 1930s or late 20s onwards, and kind of sort of thinking about the kind of historical overlaps between those men who might seem very, very different, of course, but on some levels they are very, very similar.
So the proto-fascist, you see them as it's a proto-fascist state. Is it this kind of feeling victimized, I guess, in this case, they feel victimized by women?
So for incels, or then also other, I mean, it's not just incels, other kind of manosphere communities as well. Apart from the fact that they are quite often quite actively.
What are the other?
So there's, I mean, this kind of manosphere term is kind of a very loose kind of descriptor of. I mean, it's used by many of those men themselves, but it's also kind of used by the media and so on to describe a kind of sort of clustering of sort of male communities that are often about men. So they're sort of men's rights activists. That goes back, I mean, at least until the 60s, that are more about sort of making the argument that because of feminism, now we need a sort of masculine movement now and so on, because men are losing out, and they sort of often tend to be much older men, and they kind of look at things like, I don't know, custody rights and or kind of legal rights following divorce and things like that. But some of these kind of discourses have also infiltrated younger communities in the manosphere, like incels, but there's also what's called the red pill community. I'm not sure if
you mentioned the black pill, and who are the pill and the black
pill? So the red pill kind of comes out of another sort of movement, which is pickup artists, where the red pill is kind of, which is very different from kind of incels. The red pill is sort of about also very misogynist, very, very sexist in particular, sort of about they sort of come up with rules on how to kind of manipulate women when going on a date with them and so on, in order to have sex with them. This was really, really popular in the 90s. It was also really, really actually popular on kind of in sort of mainstream media, with kind of shows essentially like on MTV and so on, that actively kind of used ideas from pickup artists for kind of like dating shows and so on. And out of this came then something like the red pill, which is a huge subreddit where kind of these men exchange kind of tips and ideas and so on. So that's one. But then there's and incels are kind of completely against the red pill. They have this idea of the black pill. Their kind of worldview, where they sort of say, the red pill doesn't work. They can't manipulate anyone, incels. So the black pill is sort of a rejection of the red pill. I mean, that all goes back to this idea from the Matrix. If you take the red pill and you see the real kind of, you see reality, how it really is. And if you take the blue pill, you continue to be, kind of in your little bubble, manipulated and sort of remain in this fantasy world. And this idea, we see it across the alt-right, and it's all the time used as a kind of metaphor, so that that presumably we need to wake up to kind of reality and so on. So those are kind of some communities. I also admitted there are also kind of many others, and this kind of manosphere term is a kind of sort of way of kind of sort of clustering them together. They are not necessarily connected in any sense, or they're also not necessarily sort of organized as kind of a big space, but there is lots of overlap, or there's lots of research where academics are actually mapping the kind of overlap between those communities, where they're showing how users kind of migrate from one community to the other, or kind of are sort of occupy sort of different spaces within the manosphere and so on. But that's sort of this sort of umbrella term.
Mm-hmm. And this idea of waking up, which I kind of find fascinating in some of these groups, is the idea that they are the critical thinkers and that everybody else is asleep. And I wonder how, have you found any way to engage with this psychoanalytically or through your studies? I wonder how you might relate to someone who has this position.
In terms of sort of intervening, or in terms of sort of trying to sort of understand or kind of analyze those men.
Well, I suppose I think what I'm feeling is that we can analyze from a distance, but we then join in and collude in the distancing and the othering, and I wonder how to work with, and I can think about ways I might work with an individual, but we're also I think thinking about how we might work at a societal level. What conditions we might need to think in a Winnicottian term. How can we engage? Are there any ways in, or is this just a closed circuit?
That's a very good question. I like Winnicott in that sense, and actually in my conclusion I talk about that. So when my book is out, you should read the conclusion. No, but this is a very important question. I think very difficult, and I was also kind of when I was writing the book, and I had a first draft, and I sent it to my series editor. So this book is in a book series which is edited by Candida Yates and Caroline Bainbridge, Psychoanalysis and Popular Culture, and I sent them sort of my first draft of the manuscript, and they also kind of said to me, but how can we kind of sort of move beyond that, or how can we sort of intervene, or how can we kind of address this, or where's the hope here? And this is very difficult question, I think. And then I was really kind of thinking about that, because on some level there is no hope there. I was at another conference last week, just on incels, organized by some colleagues in Norway, and there was a presenter there, and she made the argument, and that kind of gave me some hope, that a lot of these communities, they are kind of, if you look at the members, I mean, it's very difficult to get kind of a specific sort of idea or kind of meaningful data about who actually those men are that are part of those communities, but they tend to be fairly young. So that means they also kind of grow out of these communities, hopefully. So that was her kind of argument, and I think that is something to to think about it. You know, a subculture is often sort of characterized by this, that you're part of that subculture, and you kind of grew out of it, or you're a fan of something, and then that's a phase. So I think that is something to think about. That lots of these men, they might kind of grow out of this, but equally many might not. So then the question is, and there is always a kind of danger here that we are sort of positioning ourselves as the kind of enlightened academics who it's very easy for us to kind of critique all of them, as you say. Then it's kind of, we're sort of othering them as well, and I think that's not really, and that's important to do that, to kind of perform this kind of critical work, but it's also not so helpful, and instead, is it about kind of trying to create other spaces, because of course one problem is that within these communities, often you see others trying to intervene, and they are very often immediately, they are either banned from these spaces, or they are just kind of shut down, because they don't belong there, which I guess from sort of that sort of perspective of those communities of the manosphere, that makes sense for them, because that's their space. Fine. I mean, that we can't, if that's their space, that's their space. But at the same time, it is kind of important to sort of try to create other spaces, or maybe to kind of think about that even though these communities are very violent, and they're symbolically violent, but they are also on some level, and I kind of try to develop that in the book a little bit, they are also relational, and they actually, it sounds like a cliche, I think, but they want to be in kind of relationships with others, not just with cis women and so on, but they want to be in kind of meaningful relationships with others, and they, to some degree, find these meaningful relationships online, but then they are very, very destructive relationships that don't help. So but maybe that gives us, I don't know if that gives us some hope. I don't know, and we can also bring in Anthony a little bit.
I was just kind of thinking we could bring in Anthony at this stage, and so Anthony, you work at the intersection of institutional analysis and continental philosophy and psychosocial theory and philosophies of resistance. So I'm wondering what ideas from all of that how you might be seeing these phenomena.
Sure. I mean, would you mean like incels specifically, or the kind of manosphere more generally, or?
Well, I guess incels as an instance of a community that have, and it sounds like there are also other communities that are similar but slightly different, but there's clearly some need being met, I guess, a relational need being met, or we could think it's a developmental need to be generous as well, which we are. But I mean, your talk was looking at using Deleuze and Guattari particularly, and thinking about how the identification with the authority or the authoritarian comes in, and desires for power, and some of those feelings that perhaps draw people who maybe feel powerless or fear loss of power.
I mean, I think one of the things I think is really interesting, and this is a much broader perspective than something limited to, say, incels or the manosphere, or even the alt-right, but it's this notion of grievance and lack. I mean, I think the discourses that you see really cutting across all of this is we lack something, and then it's a kind of politics of grievance, a politics of envy, that kind of ultimately leans into a kind of death drive instinct, right? I mean, the whole notion of the black pill is precisely this kind of apocalyptic, nihilistic worldview, like fuck it all, let's let it all burn to the ground because our lives can never be possibly be better. So it becomes this kind of almost suicidal pack. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't kind of expand the view to think about the way in which subjectivity kind of en masse is formed because of, around this notion of a kind of primary lack. And if we're going back to the work of Guattari specifically, this lack is not something, it's not Lacan. Guattari was not Lacan in this case. Lack is not something fundamental to the psyche. That there is no la petite objecta. Lack is something that is written into the psyche, through neoliberal capitalism, or what Guattari referred to as integrated world capitalism. And I think this has become something really important insofar as, insofar as the economic ecologies impact psychic ecologies, impact social ecologies, and you get this kind of interworking of different systems, happening. And then right in the middle of that is the subject, right? But as long as Oedipus as a fiction is kind of created to be real, as long as we're always told that desire is always desiring something that can't be achieved, then there's always going to be this politics of grievance. There's always going to be this politics of resentment. So I think really at the heart of it is you have this kind of neoliberal subject who's always taught that they will always and can only be inferior, and that somebody's always trying to get a bigger piece of the pie than them, and that they've always been wronged in some way. So that, like when you're talking about the spiral, and the kind of obsessional spiral where you turn inward, one thing I think is quite interesting to think about the capitalist system, specifically in its kind of post-Bretton Woods form, this kind of notion of creative destruction, is it's, properly speaking, psychotic. Everything is psychotic. Everything is breaking itself down in order to remake it. The boom and bust cycles become ever accelerated. The notion of acceleration in itself is a psychotic system, right? And I think neoliberal capitalism is properly accelerationist.
Yeah.
So how do we get out of bed in the morning? How do we know enough to like put on some pants and brush our teeth in the morning? So I think this notion of obsession is actually, in Lacan terms, I think all of us are obsessionals insofar as obsessional neurosis is the symptom. It's the thing that gives us the ability to get out of bed in the morning and kind of endure a psychotic system. So all of us are more or less obsessional because that's how we live through a moment of psychosis. It's how we get out of bed and how we function in society. And then where this obsession moves to, what lack it focuses on becomes the question.
Yes. So you wake up and go, what am I worried about today, or what am I angry about today? This is our waking thought. Why do I have to get up? Because what's wrong?
Yeah, exactly. Like Deleuze and Guattari talk about it as the obsession of acquiring rank, the obsession of kind of middle management, like if I can only become a middle manager, being shat on from both sides, then life will be okay. But it's always this thing of what can I do just to make life bearable and okay. But it's always about what am I angry at today? Who am I angry at today?
Mm.
So I think a properly psychosocial perspective, we need to think about that as foundational to the societies in which we live.
Mm.
And as such, it becomes foundational to the formation of kind of micro-fascistic assemblages. And then how these assemble, what kind of intersection you get between a kind of Oedipal and fascistic assemblage as they form onto each other. Where do they target their anger? Where do they target their resentment? You know, this becomes a moment of modulation, you know, questions of modulation. But this is this is something that's in the system, not by a quirk, but it's the design of the system is to have this. And I think that's something that's quite important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's really important to, as you did in your talk, to kind of zoom out from, I don't know, something like the manosphere, something like incels, or even the alt-right and so on, and that the whole internet is psychotic. Yeah, I think our whole modes of communication and so on are psychotic. But I also think things are not only psychotic, but they are also, we kind of think about capitalism and so on, they are also perverse. So
Yeah.
this kind of works really well from a kind of sort of Lacanian perspective, but also probably from maybe even from Deleuze-Guattari, because I think what has kind of changed in recent sort of decades and sort of in the wake of 2008 financial crisis and so on is that now we are no longer this kind of ability of capitalism to endlessly kind of either kind of create lack in the D and G sense, or to kind of endlessly sort of reproduce desire in the Lacanian sense, so that that there was a time when we were still believing in kind of the system and this kind of Mark Fisher kind of capitalist realism idea and so on. We were kind of, there is no alternative, but we are still kind of holding on to this idea that we can all kind of make it, and that idea is now kind of, or that sort of ideology is gone now, and capitalism is perverse insofar as it's no longer kind of able to sort of mask its own kind of contradiction, or mask its own or kind of reproduce its own kind of ideology, because now we all know that, and everyone has kind of accepted this fact that actually there's no kind of ability to make it, or that we are kind of believing in the kind of in the greater good and things like that. But everyone has kind of become cynical now, and this is the sort of cynicism that we see not only in incels, but we see it in kind of this idea of like the doomer, the doomer generation, where lots of kind of people sort of have accepted that, okay, we have something like climate change, but there's nothing we can do about it. Let's just let's just take the next selfie, put it on Instagram, and at least I can. And that's the kind of, I think, real problem kind of social media and so on. At least I can post a selfie, while the world is kind of burning in the background or something. So that's this kind of perverse and kind of it's perverse and psychotic at the same time, I think.
Gabriel, I've got more to say, but I want to bring Gabriel in because Gabriel is, like me, finishing up his PhD at Edinburgh very soon, and has written rather movingly about growing up under the fascist regime in Chile. And you also study Winnicott, and I think Tell us how you've responded to what you've heard.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and the first thing that comes to my mind is that a fascist will never call themselves a fascist. They will call themselves patriots or whatever. Like they will be really proud of what they are, and they will have different names, being right or left wing. And I really like this idea of the lesson Guattari, of this longing for a unified body. Kind of this fragmentation make us want to be unified in a body, would be like the perfect male body, or this despot or this leader that will kind of allow us to relax in a way, because there is a meaning, there is a direction. And I think that's really dangerous, and it happens in a way all the time. In Chile was Pinochet, and he will be the person who knows everything, controls everything. And a lot of people keeps loving him in Chile. Like it's not something of the past, it's something like now we just had elections yesterday. So just now we will change the constitution that Pinochet wrote after 30 years. So in a way, his legacy has been there until now. And it's just 30 years after that people are starting to say, we can do something by ourselves and something different. But to arrive to this point, we had like 2 years of protest and people losing their eyes and going to jail and being punished, and I don't know, so many, like there was so much fight just to arrive to this place.
So this is a fight for recognition of a different, that this is not really reality. I guess, is this when people are fighting against a regime that says, we are the benevolent patriots, but this is not people's lived experience. It seems to be quite hard to fight. You have to fight against an identity. Is that right?
Yeah, I think there is an identity, and I think there is a lot of media and a lot of discourses of this fear of communism, this fear of chaos, this fear of that we will lose control, basically, we will lose money, we will lose something that doesn't allow for a change, basically. You are all the time scared, and it's better to have this party or these people who kind of know what's best for us. And I think, as Anthony was saying, when we live in a schizophrenic society, these things give us some meaning. At least, at least we have some kind of direction. And I think there is a huge challenge on how to think a way that allows these multiplicities without feeling threatened by them. I think that's the challenge. Finally, how you allow difference to happen without feeling threatened by difference. And I think it's interesting to bring Winnicott. I am proposing this idea of the holding machine, mixing Winnicott and Deleuze and Guattari, with the idea that we need spaces that kind of you just hold space for it to be safe and for allow creativity to happen in a way, and how that is so different than fighting between machines in a way, or this paranoid machine of Deleuze and Guattari. So yeah, that's one idea that I really like, of how you create space of holding, where you allow this conflict, but in a safe, protected, kind of loving space.
Yes, I was thinking about that idea of the state as a facilitating environment. And in our context here, where that is belittled as nanny state, and how the language matters. And I think what talking about fear and it being such a powerful disciplining emotion, and how people are disciplined by the fear at the core really sort of struck me. And partly because I wanted to come back around to thinking about affect and emotion and the ways that they move, and actually the ways that we might move through the feeling. And I wonder, Jacob or Anthony, if you want to come in about the interactions, the effective interactions, and whether how we whether there is any space that we can create as we knowingly engage in our psychotic clicking and lives and watch ourselves in this machine.
I mean,
oh, go on.
No, you go for it, Jacob.
I think that's I like Winnicott here in this context. I think that's really interesting. At the same time, I think we could also, with Winnicott, we could also kind of see something like, like QAnon, or the kind of Q conspiracy theory that I think Anthony knows more about than I do. We could also see that as a holding environment in a sense, because it's all about, there's like a God figure, Q, and all the kind of believers. They are just kind of waiting for the next, or they were waiting for the next kind of message from God in a way, and that seemed to be providing lots of kind of holding qualities for those members, and it's the same with all of these kind of communities, and certainly the case in the manosphere, but it's also kind of thinking about affect and so on. I think it's also the case, or it's the ideology of fascism itself, that fascism promises holding and promises a kind of sort of total, or kind of totality body, where everyone is sort of held together. Of course, that it doesn't really deliver on that, and that only works by destroying the other. But I think in thinking about kind of affect and so on, there is this kind of affective state, or kind of affective bodily state of sort of fragmentation that lots of people have, and that this is responded by a kind of a desire to be held and to be with it, or to be in a kind of sort of transitional space maybe, and how to create those spaces so that they don't become based on exclusion, that they are not these kind of exclusionary spaces where lots of people are excluded. I think that's a big question. Certainly, the current sort of model of kind of communication, or the current sort of platform-based economy that we see all over the internet, is not the answer, because that certainly cannot really provide any holding environment, I don't think. So we also need a kind of change in technology, and we need a sort of different ways to facilitate holding. One thing I've been thinking about in that context, but I don't know if that is an interesting kind of alternative, is something like Clubhouse. I don't know what the others think of that, which is just kind of, it's just based on kind of communication, or kind of talking to each other, and it hasn't got all these kind of psychotic metrics and likes and narcissistic kind of display of subjectivity that all these other platforms have, maybe to a much stronger degree.
Although Clubhouse has been to a small degree infiltrated by the QAnon folk.
Okay, yeah, and also by all these tech bros and crypto, by the crypto bros. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, maybe that's inevitable. I don't know.
that the tech bros are going to come. I also really like this idea of a kind of holding machine. Really like that. And what I think is kind of interesting in that is you get something not dissimilar to a holding machine in institutional psychotherapy and institutional analysis.
What is institutional psychotherapy?
Right. So there's this whole history, right? Really quickly, institutional psychotherapy is this kind of post-war movement of radical psychotherapists. So it started, well, to say it's post-war is a little bit weird. Technically, it began with the Spanish Civil War. So that you had this guy, Francois Tosquelles, who was known as the Red Psychiatrist, who ended up in exile in a refugee camp in France. And then shortly before the Nazi invasion of France, he was plucked out of the refugee camp and sent to Saint-Alban Hospital, where he quickly became the director of the hospital. And then during occupation, they transformed the hospital into this kind of therapeutic community, integrated it with the village. It was largely based on, was it Herman Simon, his book on institutions, with Lacan's PhD seminar on psychosis, with a lot of Freud and a lot of kind of classic anarcho-Marxism thrown into the mix as well. After the war was over, they took on two junior doctors, Franz Fanon and Jean Uri, as well as a very young student intern, Felix Guattari. So you had this weird moment where you had Tosquelles, Fanon, Jean Uri, and Guattari all working in the same place at the same time. And that was the kind of nexus point of what they called institutional psychotherapy. So Fanon was an avid practicer of institutional psychotherapy. You can see that in his work throughout North Africa. Laborde Clinic was set up as institutional psychotherapeutic clinic, and then they had this kind of network of clinics and hospitals. It was Guattari got a little bit antsy around the kind of just before the 68 uprising, and him and some interns, Anne Kidian among them, started the CERFI, the Center for Research and Institutional Formations. And that was a key movement or kind of player in the 68 uprisings. So Anne, who was helped start the CERFI, she was also the main organizer for the movement of March 22nd to the student movement in 68. And they called that institutional analysis rather than institutional psychotherapy, because then they were thinking about this beyond the clinic and outside of the clinic. And it was the work done in those two experiments that laid the foundation for schizoanalysis. So in an essay around 71, Guattari talks about if institutional psychotherapy is the movement, institutional analysis would be the practice, and then schizoanalysis is the concept. You know, so I tend to think of it kind of like that.
Thank you. Yeah.
But as a grounded practice, what you get in institutional psychotherapy, institutional analysis, is this notion of the institution as the holding space that facilitates sociality. So how you interact is dependent on the affective quality of the institution. And then Guattari talks about the institutions as a kind of modeling clay. So they can be formed and reformed. But the key thing with institutions is that without them, you have psychosis. You know, there is no holding structure. There is no form of communication or sociality without an institution to provide you with this kind of holding space. So then the practice is, how do you rework the institution in order to kind of liberate it? Mm-hmm. But this is where I think it becomes interesting, because if the institution fundamentally allows sociality through its affective experience, so then the practice then becomes concerned with the aesthetics and aesthetic of the institution. And here aesthetic isn't, it's not like a kind of flat meaning. It's something that you take from phenomenology, specifically Merleau-Ponty, and the way in which aesthetics kind of ground you, and they allow you to move, they allow you to interact with the world. You can almost think of the aesthetics as the interface to the world. So there, I think the action, political action, in Fanon, really explicitly political action, as well as therapeutic action, all has to come at the level of how do you open up the institutions which we inhabit. So that here it's not a matter of smashing it from the outside or stepping outside of it, but how do you kind of push it from the inside out and remodel it?
I'm often interested in this idea of how we might co-create those institutional relations that are normalized, the rules by which we engage, and can we shift those in collaboration? Because I don't think it's down to one person to think, what would that look like? In fact, perhaps we can't even visualize it until we practice shifting together.
And I think here's the big problem. If we're going to take it back to digital technology and platforms, it's, Guattari had this kind of quite elegant and beautiful concept of the transversal. So it's about, you don't want a kind of horizontal integration that kind of falls apart. Vertical integration is fascistic. So how do we create this kind of transversal integration where people kind of rotate through? And I think the main problem with platforms is they're still, they're still, at their heart, they're capitalistic, right? They are the kind of model for the capitalist economy, increasingly so.
They're rigid in their form.
They're rigid in their form, and even if they're kind of trying to break apart and be more fluid, they have a type of integration that is inherently kind of authoritarian. So even something like Clubhouse is still kind of, you don't cycle through different positions. I guess if you're a kind of techie person, there's Linux and there's open source stuff that would work to creating these kind of transversal positions. But this does require a certain degree of technical specialism that most of us are not inclined to acquire.
I was thinking of Minecraft.
Actually. Yeah, that's a really good example, actually.
Yeah, we should all be playing Minecraft.
Maybe. Yeah.
Oh, I feel so much better about my children now. So say a bit more about Minecraft and the possibilities then. Is that because you can create, the user creates?
I think, yeah, I mean, I haven't really used or kind of played Minecraft. It's not really a game, is it? It's like, you can basically create your own world and then sort of do things with it. So you are very free in, you are not kind of thrown into an existing structure like a normal kind of video game where you are then sort of interpassively or kind of passively sort of navigating through or kind of going through this world, but you can actually create whatever you like and then sort of do things within that world as you please.
I mean, Minecraft reminds me a little bit. I mean, this is a little bit glib, but not really. So Francois Tosquelles describes the experience of psychosis as the end of the world. So he has, his best known book is How to Live at the End of the World with Madness. So it's this process of how do you go about creating a new world after your world is ended. And this is something that Jean Uri picks up on. So he has these books like Capitalism, or Creation and Schizophrenia, or Schizophrenia and Creation, where it's about the process of world making, after your world has ended. So Uri had this large collection of patient artwork, from the people at Laborde, and he famously wouldn't show it to anyone. So if they wanted to do a kind of art brut exhibition, people would often go to Laborde and they ask, can we have some of the paintings in your archive? And he would always say no. He wouldn't let anyone see it, because for him, after you have kind of the onset of psychosis, after your world has effectively ended and you have to create a new world, so art is one mechanism of creating a world. So then he knew he was able to work with one of his patients when they would gift him a piece of art. For him, that was the invitation to enter their world and start working with them on their terms. And to a slightly different degree, these kind of sandbox games like Minecraft is the same kind of process of world making. Of course, that kind of conclusion is far from, it's not a foregone conclusion. So right now, the alt-right is targeting Animal Crossing, which is another sandbox game for recruitment, which fucking blows my mind. Because if you think of any game, like World of Warcraft or Metal Gear, these are the kind of games you would think the alt-right would be using to recruit, but they're also using Animal Crossing, which is just so weird. So the where you go with these worlds is not a foregone conclusion, but you do have this kind of space of creativity.
And I think there is a point for me really important when we talk about creativity and Winnicott, because of the idea of the true self is a self that doesn't, as I read it, is a self without the Oedipus, doesn't need the superego to keep incorporating society in a way. So for me, it's like a self without the cut of Lacan.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what we are missing in a way. It's kind of, or we go to Oedipus, or we go to schizophrenia. And I feel that with creativity, we just keep creating worlds and keep kind of making cultural experience in a way without the need of this kind of name of the father or castration or
you get this in Guattari as well, definitely. How can we have creativity without the kind of castration? Or castration is something that he feels is imposed upon us rather than,
Yeah, I think this is fascinating. I think that throws up kind of huge questions about essentially how we want to live with that, or those that are non-human, and I think that's really interesting how that's kind of discussed in like affect theory, new materialism, and so on. That's all kind of moving away from psychoanalysis, actually, maybe for good reason. But I think I'm all for kind of de-Oedipalizing psychoanalysis, and I think that critique is really strong by Deleuze and Guattari. At the same time, I think it's also we are kind of very firmly kind of often situated within very Oedipal relations, and we can't just completely argue that those are kind of fictions, or that those are sort of just created by psychoanalysis. I think there is a sort of Oedipal kind of framework that's very often present in society. But then the question is, how can we de-Oedipalize that, and how can we also live with nature and animals and so on in ways that are not Oedipal, or where we are not always kind of situating ourselves as humans, at the sort of top and dominating everyone else.
I think it's very interesting to think about the as my research is about fiction, so I can think about how we can create fiction and imaginary spaces that are imaginary, but over time they become real. We manifest, and by introducing the idea of time and movement, we start to be able to engage with the non-human spaces as well and recognize them as real, while at the same time not then becoming disembodied from our own experience, and being able to sort of, you know, return into actually our human space, and our embodied reality, and to be able to make space for both. It might involve an oscillation between states of mind, rather than thinking we have to be able to hold the whole picture. That was all I wanted to say for now. I could see Anthony wanting to come in.
No, I think I had something very profound to say, no doubt, but it's kind of out of my head at the moment. But I do want to kind of pick up on what you said about the process of fictioning, just to say I absolutely agree with you. And I think you get this in Deleuze and Guattari. This is why Anti-Oedipus, you know, whilst it's a brilliant book, it's also, I don't want to say it's problematic, but it was written with this kind of exuberance, you know, like, we're going to de-Oedipalize. Oedipus is a fiction. You don't need him, you know, and this is why I think it's really interesting when you look at Anti-Oedipus in relation to the rest of their kind of oeuvre, is when you get to Thousand Plateaus, it's much more sober. You know, it's a much more sober text, and it's much more thinking of like, right, there's real Oedipal conditions in society where it's not a matter of just ripping them away. You know, how do we chip at it slowly, you know, and slowly start to kind of take on, you know, the despotic signifier that has filled itself with this kind of meaning. And because it has meaning, it has a material value, even if it is inherently, you know, if it was created as a fiction, but it now has a material weight. So then how do we chip away at that weight? Just to say, I totally agree with you that it's a matter of how do we start working on these fictions that have become system sustaining.
Basically, how important is the space of art and creativity and fiction and, I don't know, kind of transitional spaces in Winnicott's words, for having this open desire, in a way, this not desire of lack, but a desire of productivity, and that it's not that you are missing something outside, you are creating that thing that you want, in a way, through fiction or through art or through, I don't know, creative practices in your life.
Or through protest as well. One of the most interesting kind of slogan-y things I've heard in the last few years actually came out of the protest in Chile, right? You know, that one thing they kept saying, that like, Chile was the laboratory in which neoliberalism was born. So now it's going to be the lab in which neoliberalism ends. You know, but as a kind of thinking about that quite seriously, I think that's really interesting to think about protests as now this kind of creative form of expression. You know, and how can we kind of start really pushing against these kind of calcified institutions.
It's really beautiful. I haven't been in the protest, but they are like a party, basically. Like people are dancing, and it's like a carnival, and there's people fighting with the police in a corner, so the police cannot enter. But in the center, there is just fun and music and movements and small groups that are organized for dressing in a way and dancing in a certain way, or musicians. And it's quite interesting, that configuration of keeping the police apart and then having this fun, and that started creating like a different discourse, and I can see how everything started changing through those protests in a way.
So we don't actually address the discourse, the fascistic discourse. It's more about creating other discourses and creating diversity and alternative potential spaces of experience, and leaving it to individuals to account for these differences and these other possibilities. So I really like the idea of adding in and of creating a new space in the middle of something that's feeling very rigid, and you introduce this possibility and let people experience as they will and see where it takes them.
I completely agree with that. I think that's beautiful. At the same time, I also kind of want to bring in sort of the boring superego again here, and I don't think we can't live without the superego. As much as I like Winnicott, and also maybe this applies to Deleuze and Guattari, is that there's also a creativity in fascism, for example, or if you look at the alt-right, how creative the alt-right has been, or how the success of the alt-right is precisely down to creativity. Absolutely amazing. I mean, they were kind of stealing things from the left and so on. We know that, and kind of co-opting kind of left-wing tactics and all of that. But the creativity of the alt-right is frightening, or used to be frightening. Maybe now it's kind of maybe sort of not so powerful anymore. So the question for me is also then how it's important to create those spaces, but how do you police is the wrong word, but how do you how do you where's the kind of super ego? Because I don't fully kind of agree with this critique, but this is always the kind of critique to Deleuze, Guattari from kind of more psychoanalytic thinkers, that now everything is right. It has become a rhizome. Everything is kind of rhizomatic now, and it's all look where that has taken us. We are in this kind of platform world now, and look what's kind of that what's that's done to us. So yeah, how do we stop the wrong kind of creativity from happening?
I mean, I think one of the things too, you're right. You're absolutely right that the alt-right has been remarkably, terrifyingly creative. In the same way in which and you get this analysis throughout the kind of what's often clumsily referred to as the kind of post-structuralist left, but the way in which capitalism is the most creative, dare I say, it's the most revolutionary system we've ever known, right? Because capitalism is perfectly fine to burn itself to the ground in order to remake itself anew. I mean, just look at the transition from a kind of post-Fordist system to the platform system that we have now. This is one of the problems, I think. Revolutionary thinking needs to not think within terms of capitalist production. This is why a simple clash of forces, dialectic kind of history doesn't really get us anywhere, because capitalism's too good at remaking itself. And the alt-right is incredibly good at remaking itself. And I think that's one of the things that we have to. I mean, I think you get this a little bit in group analysis and Fuchs, and the way in which a group matrix functions. For political praxis, or political philosophy even, there's no better example in my mind than Zapatismo, and the way in which like the caracals function, the way in which you kind of cycle into and out of the identity of Zapatistas, the way in which the mask, the pasamontana, becomes a kind of mediating force for how you move into and out of the subjectivity. But this becomes a way of creating what Guattari would refer to as, these transversal positions. So here I think you have to think about, it's not, and this is the problem is, no, nothing's a rhizome except for crabgrass. The internet's not a rhizome, it's a diffuse network, right? Often people mistake horizontal integration for rhizomatic kind of structures, and they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
I also see it as a compound becoming development. So becoming will be this constant transformation that's fully rhizomatic, and development means that you achieve a higher order of complexity. And how you bring both. Development is vertical, and the rhizomatic is horizontal. Maybe it's the same as transversality, but how you open the space for more options, more creativity, but at the same time how you aim for a higher complexity. And maybe that's more superego, I would say. That's how you make it more efficient or more functional or more democratic, whatever, that you need this superego function in a way at a certain level, to just not stay just in this, I don't know, circularity of, I don't know, the same basically.
I'm starting to feel that we're moving into quite an abstract territory, and bearing in mind our time, I wondered if we could sort of gently bring this into a context again. And the one I have in mind is, and I don't know if I'm getting this right, but you talked about the co-opting ideas of the left by the right, and I can certainly think about the kind of the very so the hippie kind of movement, and the ways that people that might be very interested in looking after their own health then somehow start to share ideas with very far right groups. And I'm just wondering if you could sort of speak a little bit to how you might understand that process of how people seemingly are very much on the left and somehow emerge very much on the right.
I mean, this is something that I think about a lot. It's kind of the subject of the last book I wrote as well. But I think one of the things you have to think about here is the notion that microfascisms are not unique to any political ideology. Mm-hmm. You know, they're as diffuse as the question of power itself. You know, these kind of identification with authoritarianism, things like that, are not unique to the right. And also, what we understand to be the left is often built upon legacies of colonial exploitation, legacies of race and racism. You know, I already, you know, way before the pandemic, way before you had yoga moms becoming QAnon supporters and then showing up, you know, on the Capitol building on January 6th, I've not really liked a lot of the left, or the people that are the left, you know, kind of nominally speaking, because a lot of these kind of hippie wellness communities come out of a certain kind of relationship formed in North America and exported to Europe of settler colonialism, and this kind of creating this kind of metronomic figure of, you know, the kind of quote unquote good Indian, you know. So you get this a lot where I'm from, in the way in which Hopi rituals were kind of co-opted, turned into wellness notions, and then suddenly you have this kind of spirituality about connecting to the earth that is basically kind of drawing from indigenous peoples, draining it of its cultural value and its political significance, and then marketizing it back to white folk. You know, so again, capitalism wins again. So even on the left, we, you know, or supposed left, we see how deep histories of settler colonialism and racism become marketed back to people. So of course they're susceptible to alt-right formations. They're already kind of buying into something that has a deeply racist and colonial history. Mm-hmm. So you know, like when people talk about decolonizing knowledge, you know, that gets thrown around a lot, and it's a bit meaningless. It's used so often. But if you think about terms of decoloniality, you know, and how is it the fabric of institutions across the board have this kind of colonial knowledge embedded within it, you know, and until we start addressing the very kind of architecture of this form of knowledge, we're just going to keep coming back to the same place, the eternal recurrence.
So it's actually a similar architecture to the incel, in fact, based on lack and an identity that is actually very disconnected from its root.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, I think this is again where psychoanalysis can also come in, and also sort of wider frameworks like institutional analysis as well, because I think it's only those paradigms, or only those kind of philosophies, or whatever you want to call it, that are fundamentally about kind of sort of self questioning or kind of self-reflexivity, kind of thinking about, okay, how are we part of these structures? How are we kind of reproducing those structures that Anthony was just talking about, so that we can kind of, that we can become conscious of them, and then it's about sort of thinking about how we can change them or whatever, and that also implies like something like patriarchy or like misogyny, that just the fact that I am a white man, I'm already part of this, kind of thing that we call patriarchy, and that I'm constantly kind of reproducing that, even though I don't want to. So that's kind of the first, step. And what really actually struck me when we were doing the talk last week, and I think David mentioned this in the chat, David Jones, who's also part of the APS exec committee, that in the Q&A, there were only men speaking. There were only men kind of, sort of making comments. And I was really kind of thinking about that, why was that the case? And that's not, that it's something that shouldn't be happening, I think. Is it sort of to do with the fact that there were two men speaking, or with the atmosphere and so on? So that's something actually that we would now kind of need to reflect on and kind of think about and so on. But that's something that kind of comes with this idea, I think, of having to be self-critical.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting, and to defend myself as a gobby woman, I did hold back because I knew I'd get my chance today, but I did also wonder about the content of the incel ideology, and how that might affect women who are present, and the silencing, how one can feel silenced by a psychotic attack, really, when it doesn't make sense to you, or when you don't recognize yourself in the way you are being described. It's very disorienting.
I think I was also really struck by this as well. And a student of mine who was in the talk, her and I were talking about it the next day, I believe it was. And she was saying that one of her experiences of the talk, what was it's for her, the incels just seemed so other. It's one of those things that's like, didn't know even how to ask a question because it seemed so far away from her frame of reference. But about the alt-right, the other thing that she mentioned that I thought was really interesting was the way in which, intellectually knowing that a lot of the alt-right are white women, but also feeling so divorced from that kind of reality. The way in which so many women were involved in the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. Or the way in which the 3%ers, one of these kind of right-wing militias in America, are very proud of the fact that they have prominent women in very prominent roles within their militia, so that when they go do like machine gun training, they'll have women teaching men how to shoot machine guns. And I saw like a Vice interview with them a few years ago where this guy talked about how they're a feminist militia because of the way in which women take an active role in the militia, and again, it's just like, it becomes a really interesting place of where do you, how do you co-opt discourses? If you have the 3%ers co-opting the discourse of feminism, they get white women to kill, people of color. It becomes this really problematic way in which these discourses keep going co-opted, and then we all kind of start feeling alienated from the problem, which I think, again, I don't want to speak for women at all, but speaking for myself as mixed race, American, cis man, I feel really alienated from the problem of the alt-right, insofar as it's so I can kind of see myself there, but I can't see myself there at all. You know, and knowing that again, as someone who's mixed race, they don't think I should exist. Fundamentally, don't think I should exist. You know, I'm an abomination because, you know, it's two races mixed. You know, so it becomes alienating to see yourself, because you can't see yourself there if their existence is predicated on your destruction.
Yeah.
Like in the alt-right, they even have more kind of tolerance, if you can use that term, for people who are Black or brown, because it's like, oh, you all have Africa, you all can have Asia, we just want this place. You know, but someone who's mixed race becomes, you know, in kind of Homi Bhabha's terms, this kind of mimic threat.
Yeah. Yes, because well, again, you problematize their worldview and they problematize your existence, and I think the idea of a woman in that movement creates the tension between what is feminism and the tendency to group women together as people with a shared perspective. And of course, we don't all have a shared perspective. There's but there is the concept of feminism and equality is something rather different. And just because a woman stands behind an alt-right, does that change? Does that discount, you know, feminism? Yeah.
It becomes really sticky in the way in which they kind of co-opt these terms. You know, you can think of the argument for the invasion of Afghanistan being a feminist war to liberate women. You know, again, completely going back to this kind of very sexist rescue narrative of who needs to be rescued from whom. But it's the way in which these discourses become co-opted that alienate us from critique. At least, again, speaking for me, when I think about white supremacist groups, you know, I feel in a way alienated from critique, which is why I kind of push myself to do it.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of which, and as we come to our final few minutes, I'm wondering where you, Jacob and Anthony, where you see yourselves as you finish the bodies of work that you've just completed, and where might you go next? What in terms of developing your interest? What's drawing you? What's the next?
Well, in a way, when I kind of finish that book, I never want to kind of look at it. But that's of course that's a fantasy, because you know you like as a kind of researcher or author, like you're with that book for the whole life. So that's never gonna go away. But I'm now kind of at the moment I'm sort of thinking about doing something completely different. So I'm very interested in these sort of ideas that challenge psychoanalysis kind of sort of developments in philosophy, like new materialism or object-oriented ontology and affect theories and so on. So I'm kind of interested in sort of thinking about them and how sort of what psychoanalysis can maybe still contribute, but also how kind of psychoanalysis needs to change in light of these sort of developments that all kind of seek to kind of displace the human in a way. So that's what I'm thinking about now, which is completely different, really.
And I'm doing my best to stop Jacob from thinking about something completely different. So a colleague of mine, Diane Carr, and I are trying to put together a new research project on the gamification of the alt-right online. And I am trying to draw Jacob back into looking at these horrible things through this beyond that, a lot of my work outside of this to kind of keep me sane, I like looking at more vitalist stuff. So my work outside of this has a kind of dual engagement with institutional analysis, especially the work and legacies of Frantz Fanon and indigenous resistance that we get in Arizona, as well as around. So a lot of my interest is in the Zapatista insurgents from Chiapas. So I know a delegation of Zapatistas are currently on the move to Europe at the moment for a quite interesting summer of networking resistance. So we're hard at work for thinking about what to do here in the UK for when they arrive.
It all sounds fascinating, and like it, yeah, it could, gamification sounds like an instance of displacing the human. So I hope you do work together to the extent you can bear it. We're kind of, well, really at time, and I just want to say that's been amazing. I've really loved talking with you, with all of you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for
Yeah.
the invitation. I actually thought this was going to be, like a radio show. I thought we were like kind of playing sort of, I don't know, like a anti-fascist rather, playlist or something.
With some music. Well, I have tried music in the past. I got a bit in trouble because of copyright.
Yeah.
So unless we make our own music, we might run into difficulty. But you know, I had thought maybe we could do that, but I don't know. It's an academic institution. People want to talk about ideas, so that's what we're doing. And we will be putting this out on our YouTube channel as an audio file. So in that sense, it will be radio. And I know that there are lots of people who are very excited to listen and very sorry they couldn't be here live to listen. But I guess it's just for me to thank you again. It's been a real pleasure to meet you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for hosting this. It's been really lovely. And it's been really good meeting you as well, Gabriel.
Yeah, really nice to.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, really good to have you here, Gabriel, as well. It just fits so well with what you're doing. Okay, so I really hope we encounter each other again soon.
Thanks. Me too.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.